Hi again, listeners, and thanks for downloading the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to support us, then please do think about subscribing. Every little helps. So wherever you're listening, give us a star rating and a like, or hit subscribe to get news on when the next shiny, brand new episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast lands. But for now, please do enjoy the show.
Hi listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Today, Chris, we are doing our first film that has, I think, no animation in it whatsoever. So how are you feeling?
No, I'm feeling anxious and I'm feeling awkward. Not unlike the characters in the film, I hasten to add. It's not that I'm going to struggle. I feel like this is going to be a challenge, but given that it's Terry Gilliam, given his reputation in animation, I did a little bit of looking up, and the film does have sort of effects in it, but not animation per se. So it's going to be an interesting one for me, I think.
Well, don't worry, because me and you aren't going to have to do this alone. We have a very special guest with us, Hope Dickson Leach, who is, people know her work from the acclaimed Leveling, which received rapturous reviews a few years ago. Peter Bradshaw described it as a folk horror without the horror. Mark Kermode described it as an astonishing debut, and she's gone on to future works and acclaimed shorts and all these kind of stuff. So we're delighted to have you on the podcast, Hope, and thanks very much for getting us to talk about Brazil.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, and it's maybe one of my favourite films ever, so I'm very excited to talk about it.
Well, let's start with that. Why is Brazil one of your favourite films ever, and why did you pick it when we asked you to select a film to talk to us about?
I think I love Gilliam, I love Fisher King, I love Time Bandits, I kind of have a deep affinity for his point of view, but I think this film I saw when I was 8 years old with my father, who perhaps should have been doing a better job at censoring sort of what I was watching, but it sort of completely terrified me and destroyed me in a way that, very few films have. Sort of in the same way in the Time Bandits, it has that same kind of existential horror. And I think that was sort of, so it stayed with me. But I think the thing I love about it is that as a piece of, I'm going to just say lots of different things today. I'm sure we're going to talk about all these things. But as a piece of craft, it is sort of immaculate and devastating. And as a piece of cinema, it is visionary, obviously, but also incredibly political, which I find very exciting because I think the best political films aren't normally about politics, and I sort of love how this really gets itself enjoys the humour and gets its hands dirty with that. But I also think it's a film about cinema. So I think it's sort of lots of things that I love about films sort of all appear in this thing, and the performances, the art design, the cinematography, the production design, the music, everything is extraordinary. So there's nothing. Yeah, it's just up there. I can't kind of think of a film that is a film that I wish I'd made as much as this film.
Wow, that's high praise. I'm assuming it's a film you've revisited throughout your life, or unless you got all of that at 8, in which case, well done. But sort of, how has the relationship changed? Have you sort of, moved throughout life? Have you gone different bits of it sung more, or?
I was quite scared of watching it again for quite a long time, so I didn't revisit it for a while, and then I did, and the bits that were terrifying to me, I find quite hard to watch now, rather than scary. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's a much harder watch than I have in my head, and I think it's worth it because of that. I think the payoff for this kind of complicated narrative and this complicated characterization, delivers. And the characterization includes the world as much as the people in it.
Sure, we're big fans of world building.
We are. Well, I think one of the things for me, as I said before, even though the film isn't animated in the way that perhaps we've understood previously on this podcast, it has, and Gilliam himself has been written about within animation studies, obviously given his relationship to animation and kind of his animated links in Monty Python's Flying Circus. And so there is scholarship on Gilliam within animation studies that talks about some of the things or some of the topic areas that are definitely applied to this movie in terms of subversion and alternate meanings. And you mentioned about how the best films about politics aren't political, or they aren't about those things. A lot of the stuff in terms of Gilliam's work in animation has been connected to the idea of kind of textual and the subtextual. What's this film saying? And then what's it sort of saying underneath that? And so actually the subversive nature of the film I can totally see and trace back to some of his sort of celebrated animation work. There are other links, certainly for me. I think world building is absolutely. I was crying out for a shot of a landscape or daylight or an exterior maybe or something like this, which I thought was quite fun. And also there are some interesting, and I was saying to Alex just beforehand that it speaks very much to WALL-E, and actually the first teaser trailer for WALL-E reused the music from Brazil, Michael Camen's theme from Brazil, and I actually knew it as the WALL-E music rather than the Brazil music, and so, but obviously the film WALL-E has themes about human labour versus technology, which again I can totally see why the teaser trailer for WALL-E had the theme tune from Brazil in it. So I'm sort of coming at it in a sort of abstracted. Yeah, I found it interesting as somebody interested in animation, even if the film itself doesn't contain animated sequences.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about how you would define animation, because there's a huge amount of. I mean, I'm sure you talk about this all the time, but there's a obviously there's a lot of matte painting, and there's a lot of costumes and special effects that have been animated to, I would argue, have sort of been animated in their very effects nature. So
no, absolutely. I've got a note here. Gilliam and animation must be visual effects, because there are certain sequences in them, and actually again the film appears a lot in top 50 animated sequences, so certain stuff with Robert De Niro's character Tuttle, and there are some effect shots in there, and also I had a little note, the role of the plastic surgeon, Jim Broadbent's character, that he is about mutating form. And one of the things that animation has, and actually one of the things that perhaps connects animation to fantasy, in fact, off air you tried to claim metamorphosis for fantasy, not a week ago, in fact, metamorphosis and the changing or the changeability or the instability of the form. So for me, the film has effect shots, I guess, and special effect shots, as you say, like matte paintings, models and miniatures as part of, certainly at the end, the climax of the film with the explosion. But I guess in terms of animation, it doesn't have the illusion of life, it doesn't have movement in the same way, but it is a very animated world, and that manifests, I think, through these exaggerated characters, these exaggerated human-like characters who are exaggerated in both appearance and personality, and very extreme, and actually the subversive nature of Gilliam's animation work feeds into a set of characters that are very extreme and full of internal contradictions and juxtapositions and things like this. So yeah, as I said, I'm interested in kind of coming to the film in hopefully a way that I was not expecting, through animation as a lens.
Can I do that classic academic thing and flip the question back? Because I'd be interested in what you would define as animation in that respect then. Because this is a conversation we do have all the time, and everyone has a slightly different definition. For example, VFX artists don't identify as animators, we've discovered. So there's a whole industry distinction. But you have a slightly more, malleable definition.
I genuinely hadn't thought about it, but I sort of, because I know Gilliam's history in animation, it's sort of it feels like the same kind of continuum there. Sure. So it's sort of interesting to pinpoint at what point something, I guess, is a puppet animation, yes, no, it's kind of like, is in animation, is it just 2D, is it 3D, so it would be hard for me to kind of, I think it's, you know it when you see it, but it is kind of, if you've got something moving which is not, being driven by itself, you would kind of argue, I guess, it's being literally animated, and it's I suppose it's in the process of the film, maybe, rather than recording something doing that on its own. So maybe that's the difference. So you've got a puppet that's being engineered, but the film itself, if I may be analog about it, is still rolling, whereas presumably, traditional animation, you would argue it's the sort of changing nature of each frame.
Well, I mean, so actually when I mentioned earlier animation studies and how it's engaged with Gilliam, perhaps as a discipline, I'm going to do the awful thing of reading a quote out, but actually it's the last bit of the quote that I wonder gets us closer to Brazil. So Paul Wells has written a piece on Terry Gilliam, and the chapter is called On Being an Impish God. presumably alluding to Gilliam. He says that animation is one of the most significant art forms of the 20th century because it inherently accommodates a hybridity of artistic and cultural practices that accurately reflect the tensions between modernity and the postmodern conditions. Gilliam's animations engage with the logic of the cartoon. And maybe that's when I watched Brazil, there was something, yes, subversive, but also kind of unsteady and changeable, and these dramatic tonal shifts, and obviously everything's very creative, from the music to the set design. The role of surrealism, one of animation's key values historically, even today, is the role of surrealism, and that kind of culture of quick change. A lot of the early cartoons are about metamorphosis more broadly, and so that absurdity, that surrealism, I've written here this sort of absurd surreal treatment in an age of technology and this absence of human labour, which obviously one of the things animation is about. It's about the occlusion of labour. You don't see the process, you only see the outcome of the process, which is why definitions of animation are about what happens between the frames rather than what is visible on screen. So, and obviously machines, this film, machines, the surrealism of machines, the machines going wrong, the role of the human within that. So the logic of the cartoon, it kind of got me thinking about the anarchy of a cartoon and the surrealism of something like Brazil.
As you're talking, I'm just sort of, when I watched it this time recently, I was thinking how much this feels like a film about cinema, in the sense of process, in the sense of the machinery of cinema. And I sort of was thinking, the expectations of the love story, the heroic character, all these sort of things that, it feels like almost a commentary on cinema and cinema's relationship with these things. I wonder, even if you could take it one step further and say it's sort of purposefully not animation because it is putting that stuff in the foreground and it's commenting on it rather than... Do you know what I mean? I feel like, I wonder if there's, just as you were talking, I've slightly lost my thread, but as you were talking, I was sort of thinking, gosh, actually, it's sort of showing all the stuff, because for me it feels like a film about fiction. It doesn't surprise me there's no traditional animation in it.
It feels very material and very, in a film that's about technology and interiors and the threat of technology and that sort of futuristic dystopian quality, there's something that is very tangible. Like it feels sort of more profound than that to me. This sense of our humanity as being disconnected from those things. So whilst this, yes, is a film about technology, and you could, society, blah blah blah, the story is about the people, and about someone who is desperate to have this kind of purely fantastical experience of falling in love and being a hero and being a superhero and flying and all these sort of things that cinema sort of suggests heroes can do and should do, and all these sort of things. And so by Lowry's kind of intentions being so cinematic, but sort of put butt to butt up against with this kind of horrific reality, which is all about process and not about escape. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's something about the space in between. Process. I like that. A film about process.
It is, and it's sort of, if you're talking about the space between the frames, it sort of feels like the story we've got in our heads, which isn't on the screen, is the space between the mechanics and the process of living and the vision and process of flying. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's it seems banal to say on this podcast that this is a film about fantasy, but I want to say that because actually this is a film that has this is a fantasy world, is a dystopia, and there's a certain level of imagination that the filmmakers had to all go through, and we are going through as an audience to make that sort of speculative leap. But then, of course, the film then narrativizing it is about Lowry's fantasy, and there's quite a romantic, in the sort of traditional sense of the term, tone to this, in that it's about the celebration of the gaps between process and regiment and reality and order and all the things, and a celebration of expression and desire and all the sort of things that make us human, but we don't.
But that feels like the sort of thesis that he's saying, isn't it? Is that these are the things that make us human. Dreaming is the thing that makes us human. And I found it sort of really interesting thinking about the logic by which we kind of enter into those sequences is when Lowry falls asleep. But Lowry falls asleep, all the time, just to the drop of a hat. But it's completely believable because he's in this airtight kind of universe where you feel like they probably can't breathe and they're probably, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I buy into that logic but yes, it is about fantasy. I watched Big recently for something, and it occurred to me that one of the things Big is about is it's about play, and it's about cinema, the fact that cinema is play, you know, and it's kind of reminding us as adults to play, right? But it's in the form of the film. So the Zoltar, I'm presuming you know the film. Zoltar's, machine is never plugged in. There's never any question. We never sort of interrogate that at all because it's saying it doesn't matter. You don't get hung up on that. That's the way to kill play,
sure.
and sort of embraced in this. And in the same way, I feel like this is a film where it kind of says, okay, I'm going to give you lots of different routes to fantasy, and I'm going to put them there. But you have to. This is what cinema is about. It is about this desire to fly and this desire to experience things which aren't real. But that very desire makes us human.
Except, I don't know, I wonder how there's a certain ambivalence to how it represents the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
In the, well, it comes down to the ending, and why not get to the ending of the movie in 10 minutes? Because we'll work our way back to the beginning at some point. How you're supposed to read the ending, because I think there are two ways of reading it, and one is obviously this sort of ironic, flattening moment where you sort of realise the real sort of cruelty or endlessness of the system, whereby this sort of hope that's been throughout the film is extinguished, but then at the same time the character is blissful at the end of the movie because they've stepped away from the cruel, harsh reality that they were in at the beginning. Lowry is happier at the end than he is at the beginning. So how do we read that ending? Do we read it as miserablist, as pessimistic, or do we read it as a final celebration of fantasy over reality? Of imagination over the material? Because
I mean,
or probably somewhere in between the two.
I can't kind of celebrate the idea that.
No.
Do you know what I mean? That disconnection with any reality is the only way to be happy. As much as it feels truthful.
In which case, we have to complicate the reading that this is a movie about the triumph of the a celebration of hope. Because actually, ultimately, it's his imagination that.
Okay. No. Okay. It's not about the triumph, but I think it's about. I just think it's about our desire for escape, right? And I think that is true of the Time Bandits as well, and Fisher King, and everywhere where ordinary life is lifted by escape into fantasy. I think that's a kind of Gilliam theme, right?
Sure.
So, but no, I can't. Wasn't there a version of the film? I seem to remember this conversation where they don't go back to the thing, where they just end in the.
Where it's just a happy ending.
In the happy ending. Was that my imagination that ever happened?
I don't know off the top of my head, so I'll riff while Chris definitely doesn't just Google it.
I definitely am not looking this up and reading it off of. Yes, there's a lot of stuff around the final cut of the film and the happy ending, or the re-edit of the film to give it a happy ending and its relationship to test screenings and things like this. And it seems like there is a lot written about Gilliam's role in trying to so the film initially tested poorly, and therefore it was then re-edited with the happy ending, i.e. without that sort of.
And was it released?
Coda.
Do you know if that was released?
Which seemed to score high. I don't know. It seems to only have been done sort of internally, but I'd have to do a bit more research. But it seems like there probably is another version of the film without that coda at the end that people have seen.
Did they make it? And it's
that is somewhere.
But potentially not Gilliam. There's lots of behind the scenes stuff about the tussle in the studio, right? But not Gilliam's version. So
they released it says here that they prompted Universal to finally agree to release a modified 132-minute version supervised by Gilliam. So there seems to be there seems to be a conflict. But again, that if you erase that ending sequence, one, potentially the film's title doesn't make as much sense as it would. Oh, Brazil, yeah. But also, there's some interesting, as you say, he looks he does look happy. And his dream was prompted by a visual effect, a matte painting. Sorry, just had to get that in there. Sure. I thought, the pleasure, he's gone into an animated world.
Exactly.
And actually, that idea of being a fictional world, of characters dreaming within a fictional world and things like this, But I suppose with all narratives of escapism and things like this, the focus either is on what you've escaped from and what you escape into. And actually, so the point that actually I hope that you made earlier about escaping the ordinary world to fantasize. It's funny because the ordinary world isn't really that ordinary anyway.
Right.
So there is a really interesting. Okay, so what's more ordinary actually are Sam's fantasies at the end, which appear very sort of rural and I can latch onto this. So it's a really weird. I don't know quite what I'm saying or where I'm going with this, but that idea of escapism and how we're supposed, all because of the ending sequence. What appears more conventional or.
Yeah, I like the idea that you. Oh, sorry, that was me. That you have to. That it is ordinary. I think that is the kind of point of the artist, is to say, this is how I see the world. This is what I think life is like, and I'm going to show you that. And, and so sort of, I think this sort of horror of that universe, Gilliam said, well, what no one realised at the time was that is what people were living. And, it feels even more kind of real now, this kind of idea of some terrible mistake and the people come in and just finish someone off and take them off, and you know what I mean. In the Donald Trump's America, there's certainly a sense in which this is very real, So I mean, it's kind of, I think, in the kind of romantic notion, I suppose, of how we view things, in the true sense of romantic, that it's creating, art is creating, showing us how, influencing how we then see the world, and I think you watch something like that and then you start to think of the lives we're living in those ways.
Well, I wonder whether it's then because one of the things about political caricature is the caricature itself, it's not detached from the real, but it's an exaggeration or an intensification rather than a dilution of the real. So it's not that you look at a caricature and go, oh, that's entirely unrealistic. It's actually entirely rooted in realism because it relies on a certain cultural consensus of realism in order to make its political point and for us to understand its loaded images. And so this film, its normality is a caricature of everyday realism. But as you say, actually, it is exaggerated, but it doesn't lose its familiarity. So the processes and procedures that are a film about bureaucracy and a film about red tape, if you think about the conveyor belts, the people working at workstations, the collecting a particular form from all of those things are exaggerated and so forth, but they're caricatured in a way, or they function in the same way as caricature, insofar as it's not it's a creative treatment of the real, which doesn't automatically make it fantasy or disconnected.
Right. So I guess I'm going to ask you another technical question. What's the difference between caricature and surreal in this case then?
Well, I suppose caricature is the process and surrealism becomes the outcome. So the outcome of caricatured treatment of political cartooning, traditions in political cartooning, caricatures of Donald Trump that exaggerate certain elements of his persona, his physiognomy, his colour palette, black suit, red tie, face, hair, all these sorts of things. The outcome of that could be a repositioning of him in certain situations, and the outcome is surrealism. Or that there is the treatment of his caricature, or the caricature of somebody results in a surrealist or an understanding of a surrealist treatment of it. So in my mind, there was a caricaturing of technology, or the role of technology, the position of human labour within certain kinds of processes. And part of that caricature involved juxtapositions, involved absurdity and comedy. The film's very funny in places and then tragic in others. But then the outcome of that, you think, oh, actually, the outcome of that treatment of plastic surgery as a process, or the outcome of that exaggerated treatment of the workstation, becomes a surreal take on something. So it seemed to me that caricature, or the caricaturing of the industry, the outcome of that was, or the result of that was a sort of surrealist, or subversive reflection on it.
I think some of the satire isn't just technology, though. It's also stuff like the whole subplot involving sort of Lowry's mother and plastic surgery, which I feel like could have been written yesterday, and it would have been perhaps as poignant and relevant. So there's also a sort of societal. I mean, the word I wrote down was satire.
Yeah.
And now we're going to have to distinguish between that and
surrealism.
I enjoy you doing that.
Are we just going to define our terms for an hour? But certainly it's. I think there are two registers of fantasy, I guess, going on here, and one wants us to make a connection with reality and see it as a riffing on, an exaggeration of, a satirism of, which is the world of Brazil. And then there are these other moments of self-declared fantasy where we're supposed to see them as fabrications and use them in a slightly different way. And the first one has a bite against sort of some societal features and dynamics and things going on in the 80s, but have been going on ever since. And then the second one, I'm not quite sure what we're necessarily supposed to do with them, because I think on one level it is definitely championing them and celebrating them. Certainly visually, they're sort of sumptuous, and they're sort of you can eat them up with your eyes, these moments. And it seems to be the film is sort of it comes to life. Not that it's asleep, but it comes to life or is most vibrant when those things are on screen. But then if you think about what they do narratively, basically they articulate a very obsessive male fantasy of the female form, and I'm not quite sure they bring our hero, for want of a better word, satisfaction or joy or improve his situation in any way, shape or form. So I'm not quite sure what we're supposed to do with those moments of fantasy, because they're beautiful to look at, but I'm not sure they serve a function. Maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's good, but it's hard.
It is hard. I think, I mean, as I was sort of mentioned earlier, the idea that this is like cinema, that this is a film about cinema, felt not just truthful in terms of this sort of question, this narrative question around kind of fantasy and the aesthetics, but also about the process of making a film and the kind of, and we know that Gilliam's kind of been through this much of his life, the sort of trying to buy into the system, being knocked from one person to another, from one studio to another, from one, finding this sort of romantic notion of wanting to create and be heroic, and actually being stuck in this kind of machine. And I think when I kind of watched it this time, thinking about that and thinking about the kind of post-Weinstein kind of stuff, how it's really interesting when you look at Jill Layton and how she is defined. She is this kind of rebel, completely unfeminized, kind of no makeup, short hair, very kind of ill-fitting, large clothes, keeping under the radar, staying away. She is this sort of impossible creature. And even with this commentary, as I see it, this kind of reading of this film as making films is so hard. Yeah. You have to fight the machine. Even within that, our hero is this kind of wealthy, connected, able-bodied white man. And it's kind of fascinating how at a certain point I sort of slightly lost patience with it this time when they get to her flat, their mum's flat, and he says, "Stay here, I know how to save you." And he's going to kill her, legally on the paperwork. And I'm just like, that, of all things, given that this is the narrative we're in, where he is the hero, the most heroic thing he can do is kill the problematic version of his girlfriend. Do you know what I mean? And then the fantasy girlfriend can exist. And I'm sure that, I know all these things are intentional to some level, but you can't help but look at that and go, God, that was a film made in the 80s. You know what I mean? Because it's like, whoa, nobody thought about that. The idea that, okay, the only way to be free as a woman is to be dead. So it's a kind of, it's sort of very fascinating, once you start, as I do at the moment, I'm kind of obsessed with films that are about film, because I think that's probably one thing that filmmakers feel they know, as amongst other things. And for Gilliam, certainly it feels sort of a theme through his life. So I kind of, thinking about that, this, as So Mayer says, cinema is a rape machine, and it's just this kind of massive machine that's just sucking up, and, he tries to stand up for the right thing, and, Bob Hoskins arrives and fills his flat with ice. You know what I mean? It's just like it's really kind of hostile environment for somebody who is trying to be pure and good. And
Yeah.
Because I was when you said about it being about cinema, I was thinking, okay, so is it the labour of it? Is it the idea of kind of distraction and illusion, or in this case, delusion? The convincingness of images, which again, if he's sitting down at the climax of the movie, convinced by an image on the wall or something, and he's just in it, and so I was thinking about that, but it seems to be more like the labour of and the
yeah,
role
I mean,
of
I think it works on both
within.
levels.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I think it's so interesting, because it's sort of, it is that. Yeah, I mean, but
and reading here, and I'm sure we know that the original title was 1984 and a half, both as a gesture to 1984 and as a gesture to Fellini, which is obviously a film about filmmaking. I was also thinking about the role of satire, and I was just thinking about it now. So, caricature, exaggeration are the process, and the purpose becomes satire, or the purpose becomes, because if we think of, you said about the 1980s context, satire with its particular relationship to the political, i.e. the exposure, critique, and topical. And so I'd have to do a bit more about what was happening in the world in the early 80s, 85 in particular, perhaps a bit more of context around the film. But yeah, I mean, it's I think there's lots to say, and it seems to be made in terms of that. It's rife for interpretation, or the film certainly makes available certain moment. Well, a lot of its narrative is made available to us as a way of reading things metaphorically, or to think about, that is an extreme or exaggerated version of something, or a symbol of how one normally would do this. And so it seems very subversive in that way.
Also, interested in this, it's a film about cinema. And where this comes in Gilliam's career as a director, and I might have misremembered this, but it's not. It's one of his earlier ones, right? He did Jabberwocky was his first, or I probably misremembered that, which was very much a sort of Python-esque ensemble piece. And then this is one of his first sort of stepping away from his role on Python, his role as an animator, and becoming a writer-director. And you use the word machine quite a lot to describe cinema. And this is a very mechanical, analog movie.
It's like Metropolis.
So I just wondered if there's anything to say about his reclaiming of the machinery of cinema, as him announcing, partly is stepping away from his more, his persona at the time as an animator who, that animator that worked on Python. And he's not an animator in this film. He is a filmmaker. In the proper, film going through the wheels kind of sense of the word.
I mean, I suppose the kind of the ultimate, the consequence of all this torture is the blissful escape into a dream. You know, so maybe that's what it is. Maybe the unknown, positive, negative, whatever conclusion where he's in the bliss state. It was impossible unless you fight the machine. So, maybe he is connecting the two. Maybe.
Isn't there that famous quote from Gilliam that's something like, this is probably apocryphal, but it's something like, making a film is having a dream and then watching that dream be brutally destroyed by reality day by day on set, or something like
there we
that.
There we can finish.
Which is what happens, right? He has a dream and it's brutally destroyed by reality. So so it's about process.
But I think this is, as you say, it is quite early on, and I think post Don Quixote, kind of the Don Quixote lost years, whether he would even be able to bring himself to make this movie. You know what I mean? Because at least he does end up in bliss. That there's a more negative version of this film, I guess, where he's actually awake at the end. Where Lowry is woken from the dream.
You're right. Yeah, that's even worse, isn't it? You've woken up and realised what you've just seen is just a dream.
Or maybe that's the kind of, or maybe you just can't make anything. I don't know. It's a.
Well, it seems to be an interesting paradox. I don't know what you think about this as a filmmaker, but Gilliam is one of his personas. Gilliam is that he finds it really hard to make movies. He always struggles behind the scenes making the movie. Every movie is a war.
If they ever get made at all.
That's like every movie has that story behind it. So I just, as an outsider, you're just like, well, why would you still make them if they do this to you every single time?
Oh, yeah.
I think I probably know the answer, but I won't say it. But like, do you have that relationship to your work? Or,
oh my God, it took me 8 years to get my first feature made.
Yeah.
10 years. I'm 3 years down the line. I still haven't got the next one
Yeah.
going yet. I've got. Well, they're all sitting there. It's really hard. It's so hard, and that's why, even though you say it was his, early movie, he still would have experienced that, And whilst one of the things when I watched this movie, I was just like, you wouldn't be able to make this now because of the budget. You just would not be given this much money to make this piece of art, because it's like every detail from the cross tape over the little dog's bottom to there's not a moment missed. There's the hands typing, it's so expensive, this film, watching it, and it just kind of blows my mind.
Okay, so this is one of those moments where we pause the podcast and stop talking as we were then,
Yes.
and start talking live. Well, not live, but
We're
live.
always live and
Yeah.
not live.
This is
It's hard to record in advance of
yeah.
the moment that you're recording.
Sure, this isn't a live stream.
No,
So
that's not what we've paused the podcast to talk to you about.
No,
though.
we have paused the podcast to talk to you, listeners and potential contributors, actually, about the blog element of the website. So if you visit fantasy-animation.org, you'll see that we run a weekly blog. So the blog itself pulls in different voices from lots of different places, whether you're an animator, creative practitioner, academic, whether you've been to a film festival, an academic conference, whether you are, been to the cinema, seen an animated fantasy television program. We'd love
could
to
be an animator who's just produced new work
Yes.
and wants to talk about it, reflect on it creatively.
It could be
someone who's trying to get into film journalism, who wants to have a go at writing a review. You could just be a fan and love a particular subject matter, and you'd always want to talk about it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people kind of get in contact via the website. We have a little comments function, so if you send a little message to us with your potential idea, then we'll have a conversation about commissioning in it.
There's a tab, isn't there, at the top that says something like contact us
Yes.
and submit form. Click
So
on
you
that.
can contact us. And also you can follow us on social media, so give us an @ on Facebook, send us a message. So give us an @ on Twitter or send us a message on Facebook and we'll get in touch.
Yeah.
It would be great to kind of publish some of the new work that's being done or hear from people that perhaps wouldn't have the opportunity to publish elsewhere. Get in touch.
Please do. Otherwise, we'll just get back to the show.
Let's.
So if you've got that kind of vision and you're sort of relentless in that vision, then it's incredibly hard. I mean, Python gave him the kind of, I guess, the leaping off point, to say this is the humour, this is the surrealist point of view, this is the kind of world we know there's an audience for this, come on board. I don't know enough about fantasy, but I sort of feel like it exists in this world in cinema where maybe there isn't as much fantasy being made as there is in different parts of cinema history. I have no idea what I'm talking
Well,
about.
there's less and there's more, in that I think there's less of these kind of movies being
Right.
made, but arguably every movie that's made over $800 million of the past 20 years has been a fantasy, right?
But that's what I mean. But like at this point in the 80s, there weren't kind of,
That
so
wasn't-
that wasn't the thing. We didn't have the same kind of geek culture, sort of as the geeks hadn't won yet.
They hadn't taken over
They
the
hadn't
world
taken
yet,
over the
no,
world.
yeah.
So it was kind of that sort of extraordinary thing. But, when I watched this, one of the things I felt really deeply sad at is thinking about some of the films that I have tried to make with the same kind of attention to every moment and inventiveness of every moment and have not been able to make. And now I'm at the point when I write something, like I could never write a movie I could never write a movie like Brazil. But, I censor myself constantly because it is so hard to get movies made and it is so hard to get movies with that kind of budget. And I just sort of, and because movies aren't making money at the moment, it's just sort of almost impossible. And so it's become this thing. It felt really sad watching that film because I thought, God, this is one of the reasons I make films.
Yeah.
And yet I would never write a sequence like that because I would know that it would have to go, and it kind of makes me really sad because one of the things I love about cinema is spectacle and, this sort of surreal kind of inventiveness of creating a universe that's, other, but yet this universe, and it sort of feels impossible now. So it's sort of, I feel like it's a really sad film. It's a really poignant film, and it's sort of extraordinary that it exists. but it's also devastating that it exists, because it sort of feels like the apex of something to me, of kind of cinema. Like, I don't think we're going to make movies like that again. I think the only movies that get made with that much money are superhero movies now. Yeah. And I can't see that changing for a long time, if ever. You know, so it sort of feels like this very lost art, you know, this time. And what does that mean? You know, what does that mean to the sort of work of fantasists? And, you know, I mean, I'm writing a book at the moment because it's the only way I can, you know, tell the story I want to tell, because it's just too expensive. You know what I mean? It's sort of devastating to, yeah.
There's loads I want to riff on with this, because, I mean, one of the synonyms of fantasy we trade on this podcast is I guess, creativity, and we're interested in the fantasy of the creative process. And both the film, but actually what you're saying there about your process, and I think perhaps I'm more interested in that, is you have a fantasy, for want of a better word, of how your movie could be. And the fantasy, because it's in your head, both doesn't cost anything and also does not need approval of financiers, audience, demographics, all the sort of industrial concerns that you might have to have. And then that fantasy is slowly censored by yourself, as you just said there, by the world as it responds to the fantasy, and you get to a point where the fantasy sort of expresses itself as a fart, or a squeaky fart, rather than a sort of nope, not doing that analogy, but it announces itself in a way that's sort of unrecognisable from what it was at the beginning. And part of that is the medium you're working in, because it's so invested in labour, the real world, industry, technology, all this kind of stuff. And it's not a coincidence that you know, no one worries about who invented what Microsoft Word software so that they could write novels quicker. When we write about the history of fantasy writing, no one worries about when different types of pens were invented, but we worry about when stop motion was created, or when CGI was invented, all this kind of stuff. And special effects is foregrounded within the study of fantasy cinema, because it has to negotiate with the real world and has to negotiate with technology.
Yeah, but I would say to that I think, you know, that that's the challenge of kind of cinema. One of the challenges is that you have to train your fantasies to be deliverable. You know what I mean? So you have to know what can be done and then create the fantasy within it. So I think that's why people like Jonathan Glazer, people who are working kind of with great new technology, special effects in commercials and places where they've got those tools, can actually infiltrate those realities of how you make these things happen, can infiltrate their ideas, and they can start to create better ideas, right? So it becomes then, you know, more challenging for people who aren't engaged at that level. Do you see what I mean? And sort of, so it's one of those harder things to kind of keep fighting and keep thinking, okay, but you also don't want the technology to already exist, because then someone else is going to think of it. So there's also that challenge of like, okay, I've got this idea, and it's this great idea, and I'm going to tell you how we're going to do it. And that is also, I think, part of the job, the delight of being a filmmaker, is that you kind of go, you know, I just had this great idea and I know how we can do it. We can pull it off and it's going to look amazing and it's cheap and it's easy and we can, you know what I mean? It's like that inventiveness is always going to be there. But yeah, so it's that marrying of the two things. And it's amazing how many times I read a script and I'm like, I know exactly what this person's trying to do. It's impossible to deliver, or it just won't land. You know, it won't, what you think is going to be on screen is not what you've written. Do you know what I mean? And you can't deliver that. It's not going to hit an audience in the way you want it to, because this is something that belongs in a book, or this is something that belongs in a play. You're not thinking about cinema when you're writing this scene. And so you have to kind of, it's the Ozu thing, you know, you just keep learning all the time. My relationship with story and cinema changes kind of all the time as I kind of understand more profoundly what I think it means for something to be cinematic. So it's kind of that constant self-education, inventiveness, and then trying not to censor yourself. But as I said, you know, the machine is there, and that machine has been battering. You know, it's very, very damaging, and I do self-censor all the time, you know, and there feels like there is this need for a permission to make films, you know, which is kind of part of the the thing of Brazil, you know, it's like I need the slip, I need the right slip, I need these people to sign it, and I need those people to sign it, and then, you know, and that's how films get made, and so it's very permissible, and you know, I think it's so interesting that's sort of becoming such an enormous question around who are the people who are allowed to make these films at the moment, like who are the people who feel like they need to ask for permission versus who are the people who are just doing it. And the sort of false characteristics that sort of get ascribed to those different populations, like, well, men just go out and do it, or you know, women feel like they need to ask for permission, or, you know, do you know what I mean? Those kind of weird things that are coming into play, you know, this is why we don't have more working class auteurs, because they, you know, suffer from imposter syndrome. Is this sort of new conversation that's going on at the moment. And, you know, it's really interesting, but it shows also how absolutely crucial that magic thing that filmmakers have to have, that perseverance, that inventiveness, that selling themselves, that whatever it is, that thing where you walk into a room and you're like, I'm a leader, give me $100 million, I can tell a story that's going to captivate the world, you know, and it's sort of incrementally, who has that, who gets to have it, and why does that get eaten away all the time, you know, from certain people and not from other people. And it's there's no rhyme or reason to it, you know, and I don't know. So I feel like I've pulled us all the way down.
No, I was going to say, within the context of something like the narrative of Brazil, presumably Sam is the creative voice. So Sam is the creative, or the person who is trying to navigate all of these processes and procedures, as well as people that are, some people are cooperative with him and some people refuse to cooperate, and all these sorts of things. So he's the sort of, you know, I don't want to say the surrogate director, but there's a certain,
if we're telling that story,
you know, there's a certain element, and so I wonder then the role of his daydreams and his fantasies within that narrative. And you said right at the start that his ability to fall asleep really quickly. So, and going back to the point about the 1980s fantasy and the role of fantasy, this seems a fantasy less about. My feeling is that fantasy worlds, Lord of the Rings, etc., are about the world that the film takes place in. This one seems to be a fantasy about the world that people normally have to escape from to go and watch those fantasy movies, and it becomes a fantasy about that world. And so given this film analogy, given this, or the analogy of cinema, this is a film about cinema, about creativity, and the role of the human in a process that is, you know, mechanical and so forth. Does that add extra purchase onto his fantasies or his dreams that feel a lot more like, you know, the film is science fiction, but his fantasies are often romantic comedies, or they're often romantic dramas, or something like this. It feels like he dreams in genres. He lives in a film noir science fiction sort of meld. He's dressed a lot like a private eye, and is sort of very much a detective in lots of ways, and trying to work out and get clues and figure things out and so forth. But he seems to dream in sort of soft focus. And so I just wondered what the role of these fantasies are within this narrative of creativity and industry and labour and things like this.
I have a theory now. I didn't 20 minutes ago, but I have a theory now, so I bet it's good. Which is, one of the things about filmmaking that hadn't struck me until we had this conversation was that if you're an author and you have a fantasy, for want of a better word, you need a pen and you need a piece of paper, and then the fantasy can be enacted into the world. All right, people might not read the thing if you don't get it published by some sort of, you know, power structure existing thing like that, but the thing can exist as an object that can be shared. But you don't have that luxury with film. No. Even, you know, with the celebration of digital technology, democratizing all that sort of stuff. If you have you have to make a film, you need the world to cooperate with you a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit. And if you're faced with an uncooperative world, which Lowry is in this, you cannot bring that fantasy to life, and thus it remains a vacuous fantasy, because it doesn't, you know, fantasy provides no satisfaction if we know it's just a fantasy. But as a psychological process, you know, we talked about play. Object relation theorists like Winnicott talk about this all the time, about play sort of physicalizing and bringing into life, and that's where the satisfaction is. So as long as Lowry's fantasies allow him to enact things in the world, they have purchase and they have value to the story, to him as a character, to us as a viewer. And it's the sadness of that final shot is that finally we have a fantasy that will never be enacted. We have a fantasy that means nothing because it can't come into the world. and that might speak to some of the sort of dissatisfaction about that feeling that you're describing so eloquently of having a cinematic fantasy as a filmmaker, that at one point you go, it's not going to come to life. It's not going to come to life. I'm just Lowry in the chair.
Yeah.
And there's loads of things.
Keep it light, Alex.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, who knew Brazil would be this?
It's therapy. This is therapy, isn't it?
We're just Lowry in a chair.
I feel like that's the sadness of the end. It's that all the others have a chance of coming to life in some way, shape, or form.
Although, well, that's interesting, because that one at the end is the only one that is real. The others are, completely unreal. Him with wings, the cage, those baby-headed monsters, they're very much, but it's interesting that, we see them as real to him in the story, and they're the ones that propel his action, they motivate him, they kind of engage him, and he can see where they connect with his real life. That they're kind of, when he starts to see Buttle's widow, with the thing of it, and you can kind of start to kind of, there is that sense that we understand how these nightmares and visions have been created. They have been created from his real life.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. So lucid dreaming, a lot of his fantasies, that he can connect up, or we as spectators can connect up, the reason he's fantasizing or dreaming about that is because this happened earlier on, or that character. I wonder where his fantasy in the final sequence, which is very different, it's different from other fantasies in the film because it's grounded in a certain sense of realism, but equally it's different from the rest of the movie because it is like daytime, outside, rolling hills, landscapes, and this is very much a film of interiors and the claustrophobia of interiors. It's interesting. I wonder where he had access, what was it in the world of the film, hypothetically, that got him dreaming and thinking about that in that way?
Well, it's the continuation of their escape, isn't it? So actually what's interesting, and it's sort of, I'm suddenly thinking about this, is the reliable relator kind of question here, narrator, not relator, because actually, she, Jill, is always long-haired and kind of blousey, wafty, and sexy, right, in the things. But in this, it's sort of, she's in her tough rebel clothes, they're escaping together. So it's sort of, it's the fantasy as the real narrative. So they've swapped places, And so actually, I guess you could even say, working back from that, is that whole story, is Jill just a fantasy the whole way through? Did that dream that ends up with him in the Green Lands start when he first saw... when he saw her at Buttle's house, when he looks up through the ceiling and he sees her for the first time, is that whole narrative actually a dream, and is the reality that he is just stuck? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's
the
like
whole film is.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
didn't begin
arguably,
with the
right?
lobotomy scene. It didn't begin in that way. It began a lot earlier because she's always positioned as a figure of
She's this,
uncertainty.
Exactly. So because the first time he sees her, he recognizes her from his dream. So has he conjured her up all the way, is the whole thing actually just...
Well, I suppose given that the film is also about appearances, if we think about plastic surgery and how the mother has plastic surgery and it is to look like, or she ultimately ends up looking like Jill.
She looks like Jill, yeah.
So you get an unreliability in there that if it's a film about contorting appearances and so forth, So suddenly
the two realities are actually coming together in that final sequence, post-bomb, as it were.
Yeah.
After that final bomb, that's when everything starts to kind of cross over, and we start to, the things from what have been definitely fast asleep dream stuff is appearing in the real world, and vice versa.
I only have a couple. I know we're journeying towards the end, but I'm interested, one, in the cast, because obviously the cast is fantastic, but also the style of the film more broadly, given that I feel a lot of the film feels very close up and very again, it's that issue of proximity and claustrophobia, and there's lots of low angles of that seem to be from his perspective, looking up at figures of authority, or certainly authority in relation to him. And actually, it's the end that we start to get these long kind of shots, and actually, so given that it's a film very much of interiors, and you gestured towards a little bit earlier, but in terms of the film's influence on your own work, is there a, because it seems not, I wouldn't say diametrically opposed to your work, if we think about the leveling, but also I guess the role of landscape, the role of space. Is there something? I'm not going to tell you the influence of the film on your own work, but was there also something within the movie that you've thought about, or could be mapped onto your work?
I think that's I think it would be stretching it to connect the two, but I think that for sure this sense of where do I belong and what is home is certainly something that feels really rooted in Brazil.
Yeah.
And that he's where does he belong? He doesn't belong in his mother's house. He's got this flat that he's being chucked out of. And that's something which I'm always trying to, I have my films always seem to kind of end up looking at is what is this notion of home, and what does it mean to be at home, and is it the buildings, is it the history of them, is it the the people within them, what is it that makes us feel at home, and how do we connect? So I think that's for sure. I mean, I think some of my short films are probably much more related, and I think the first feature I really wanted to make, and I'm now writing as a book, was far more kind of surreal, and in that kind of sort of pushed, absurd realities where I'm kind of enjoying the kind of hysteria of groups of people, and the kind of sense that you're the straight man among the madness, and I think that is something which I love, and just these circumstantial kind of madnesses that people have kind of come up with. And certainly in Morning Echo, where you've got a family who are pretending it's Christmas, or pretending it's not Christmas because they pretended it was Christmas, and this sort of idea that decisions we make that we must stick to in order to maintain some sense of order in our lives, I think that's something which feels really true to me. So I would love to have more absurd and abstract and surreal elements always, and I think that was the moment when I went to do a rewrite on the leveling and came up with a hare swimming. That was something that was really suddenly made it a film for me, rather than drama, TV, whatever, because the metaphors were always there, these kind of metaphors of dredging the water, dredging the rivers and the gills to clear them out so that the water could run, and understand sort of that feeling like this metaphor of the family that don't talk to each other. But I had this amazing conversation with a farmer who told me about the night of the floods when he was evacuating his farm, and cattle with water up to their chest, and the tractors were, spluttering and drowning, as it were. And he wanted to save a hare, and he had found there was a hare sitting on the wall, and he wanted to take the hare and put it in the... And he thought, this is ridiculous, I can't save the hare. I've got 800 cattle, I have to get out of here, I've got my family, I've got, we all need to go. But that, nevertheless, that kind of stayed with me so much. And the same guy talked about, during the floods, because all the mice, because everything was drowned, that the mice were scurrying along the tops of the hedges, and owls falling out of the sky because they were starving, because there were so few mice and things. And so those were images that were in the script for a long time, and that I wanted to be there, because it felt really important to me, this sort of question of what nature, what's going on with the nature, and how that feels around this question of loss, which is what the leveling is obviously about. But so the sequence with the hare was actually written as one sequence, and it was sort of the opening 2 minutes of the film, and my God, it was hard to shoot, on the budget we had. But so in the end, it worked better when we chopped it up. And what we felt as well is it didn't have any context. it just didn't. You didn't know what it meant. You know what I mean? It was just, and then you forgot it, and it was kind of wasted. Whereas I think once you start to kind of have questions about, is Harry the hare? Is Clover the hare? What does it mean? It suddenly became much more powerful. And what we had was all this footage. So talking about the machine and creating the kind of, trying to replicate your fantasies that are in your head on the set, as it were. You also have this opportunity to create magic that wasn't planned, if you're, depending on what kind of film you're making, obviously, and you're this kind of low budget. So the opening stuff with the fire, that was just, we were waiting for the coals. The coals were all scripted, the hot coals they run on, and we were waiting for them all to heat up. And so I had these guys, and we had the fire breathers, and so we just started running around. Nanu was like, let's get some of that, it looks amazing when they blow the fire. So we started just shooting all this sort of stuff, and it stood in for the kind of, the night of the party, which actually in the first draft of the script, the first act was the party, and then it kind of went. And so suddenly when we put it together, it just felt like, actually, I kind of want to see what happened that night, or at least a version of it. So I think, as someone who's sort of really aware of the relationship between process and content, process and output, I think this is a diametric opposite in that, but I'm sure, I've no doubt that there would have been amazing surprises, nevertheless, on a film like Brazil when they were shooting it, because you always have that magical element of what do people do in that situation? What is, how do they use a prop? How do they actually deliver that? How does the light fall, when you sort of, I suspect they had it, but for us, for the leveling, for low budget stuff, it's you kind of have to create an environment where you are you're creating opportunities for the magic and then capturing it. So it's chaos, really. It's the idea of creating chaos that you can capture. And so that's terrifying, and you can't put that in a budget. And, so that's the sort of step where you have to bring your fantasy to real life of, I guess, fancy of the director as God, of I'm going to create chaos now, in whatever way it works. I can't even remember where we started, but I'm sorry.
Can I go on? Just because I didn't think Gilliam when I first saw The Leveling either, but obviously rewatching it, your decision to do that, at least, I don't know, for me as a viewer, creates this there's an opportunity to read the hair sequence as a recurrent dream. Yeah. And it creates the question, for me at least, of whose dream is this? A dream?
Yeah.
Whose dream is it? Yeah. Is this what happened, or is this a nightmare of what might have happened? So there is, to me, an interweaving of dream sequences.
There we go. We found the link.
Well, it certainly creates that haunt. A lot of the reviews, I read quite a few reviews, and a lot of them gesture towards there being something beyond realism going on. I can see the temptation to review everything. You used the word realistic a minute ago, but I was wondering how much you embrace that term, because there just seems to be a temptation to describe every sort of new, interesting British indie shot on location. I don't sing realism. Here we go.
I certainly. I mean, I appreciate that film was made kind of in a realist way, but it's not my favoured kind of. I mean, I hope there's more. But I think that's partly because I sort of, certainly with The Leveling, I felt much more that the people I was looking at, the cinema I was looking at, was French and kind of the sort of French cinema of the sort of bourgeoisie and the failing bourgeoisie and the kind of cinema of rural life, which I feel like France has a much richer kind of theme of, and that was something that was felt more important. So I was kind of slightly, I'm like, I don't know if it's a realist film, but I guess it is.
It's kind of gothic. It's kind of, I don't know. I see tones of that, and obviously a lot of other reviews did as well. So.
I just don't watch that kind of those films, so that's why I think I was kind of like, oh, okay, I guess it's a folk horror. I don't know. Not really my thing. But I mean, it's funny. I mean, making a film is a weird thing. It's just a weird thing. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, we're sitting here ascribing all these kind of intentions to Gilliam, but I mean, who knows?
Or we won't have a career.
Sorry.
We need to ignore intention, or we're screwed.
I just wanted to again, I guess as a final point, and it's an appropriate to begin or to end with the beginning of Brazil, because it goes back to your point about, I guess, The Leveling and belonging and home and family and Clover's return and all these sorts of... The film of Brazil doesn't give us any sense of belonging because it doesn't. I think it begins with. I made a note. It begins with somewhere in the 20th century, so it's quite vague, and there's not an establishing shot, and then Gilliam doesn't break down the space. So our geography is immediately. Or the film seems kind of untethered from a particular space. And as you said, there are lots of locations in the film. So Sam can't be at home because he's being moved out, and I don't quite understand the geography of where he works. And so, yeah, it seems quite appropriate that Brazil should begin, as we end this podcast, with somewhere in the 20th century, because that sense of that lack of fixity is again a counterpoint, I guess, to the end of the movie, where he's remains seated and quite content, but often in his mind he's travelling and escaping and moving, but actually he's not, and it's only within his, and it goes back to your point about him flying, he seems to move and be free within these fantasies where actually everything is enclosed, and there's a real, and certainly as a spectator it is a hard watch, I think, Brazil, and I'll have to watch it again and again to sort of break down the space. I don't think you could draw a map of the locations and it's not coherent, but I think that's part of it.
It's intentional, I would think.
Yeah, it doesn't give you that establishing shot that the film can then break down and ascribe, okay, so that location works there and leads on to here. And you have characters, so Ian Richardson's character, Mr. Warren, who seems to just be perpetually walking between locations and corridors. And and I think it's, in terms of spatial, this kind of film's... in terms of our information retrieval, it is very difficult because of the organisation of space. And that's what I'm going to sound that.
Okay. Do we have any final thoughts
on
Brazil?
No, it is a hard watch. I'd like to rewatch Wall-E now and see what the kind of connection is between the two.
The next podcast you just done.
There we go. Spoiler alert. But yeah.
Hope, thanks so much for sharing Brazil with us. This is going to be out in spring 2020. So is there anything happening in spring 2020 our listeners might want to direct our attention to?
Or secret things that you can tell us but we'll cut out?
I mean, Brexit might still be going on, might
Sure.
it? That's
Sure.
fun.
So
That's
you're
fun
plugging
to look forward
Brexit.
to. No, not plugging Brexit. I've just done a short film, actually, which does have quite a nice surreal thing in it, which is about women's anger, and someone ends up punching. It's quite fun. Look out for that. That's part of something called The Uncertain Kingdom, which is a sort of project where 20 films are commissioned about 2019, and a lot of different things. So there's that.
Where might people be able to
I think
find
it's going to be. I think it's going to be released.
Oh, cool.
We've actually got a release, and I think the idea with those is they want to travel them around and do kind of show maybe 8 or 10 of them, and do kind of town hall conversations and try and use them as a kind of talking point. So I don't know how they're going to do it yet, but there's some really great people making these shorts, and they're totally different kind of genres, and they're going to be really fun.
Cool.
One of them's an animation.
Excellent. Excellent.
Yeah. So you should. Yeah. I mean, it's cool. So there's that, and then I've just got, the usual lineup of films I'm trying to get financed. So there's nothing. Nothing I can tell you now, but hopefully soon.
And what about, can people find you online, on social media?
Yes, I am on Twitter at Hope Dickle, and I'm on Instagram at Film Hope at Large.
Love it.
I don't know, man. It was,
It's like that thing where you have MSN email addresses or Hotmail email addresses that are like stars at something, and you never change them. And
My personal email is still AOL, and I'm proud
Are you
of it.
still AOL?
I'm still AOL.
You see, Hope Dickle was my first email was Hope Dickle at AOL.
Okay.
Dickle is Dickson Leach,
Hopefully
right?
it isn't still already to
No, it's not. But so Hope Dickle has then become this kind of handle that goes with me everywhere, which is kind of fun.
We'll credit you fully when the podcast is released, though.
Sure.
But thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Hope. You can find us on Twitter at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. You can check out the website, fantasy-animation.org, where you can read our latest blog posts and download some previous episodes. But this has been Fantasy Animation for another episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.